introduction. I will begin on a sad note, and I will express our sorrow to the people of Turkey and Syria, and remind you of the devastating earthquake that we lived through. It's only 2 months ago, and it seems like we've all forgotten it. Let's not forget it. They need our help. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce my long-term colleague and friend, Edhem Eldem. Our many collaborations centered on exhibitions in Istanbul and accompanying edited volumes, notably Camera Ottomana, Photography and Modernity in the Ottoman Empire in 2015, and Scramble for the Past, a story of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire from 2011. Scramble is with another colleague you know very well, Professor Zeynep. Edhem Eldem teaches at the Department of History of Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. Among his fields of interest are the Levant trade in the 18th century, Ottoman funerary epigraphy, the development of an urban bourgeoisie in Istanbul, the history of the Ottoman Bank, the history of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire, the history of photography in the Ottoman Empire, late 19th century first-person narratives and biographies, Westernization and the Tanzimat, as well as Orientalism. It's a long list. His substantial book list includes French trade in Istanbul in the 18th century, 1999, A History of the Ottoman Bank, 1999 again, The Ottoman City Between East and West, Aleppo, Izmir, and Istanbul with Daniel Goffman and Bruce Masters, the same year. Pride and Privilege, A History of Ottoman Orders, Medals and Decorations, 2004. Death in Istanbul, 2005. Un Ottoman en Orient, Osman Hamdi Bey en Irak, 2010. Le Voyage à Nemrut Dağı, Osman Hamdi Bey'e, Oskan Efendi, 2010, and L'Alhambra à la Croisée des Histoires, 2021. Professor Edhem Eldem occupies a prominent place among the Ottoman historians of his generation. I would like to define this generation with historians who started writing in the 1980s. This is also my generation. Perhaps the main feature that distinguishes us is the language in which we mostly write, which is English, regardless of where we are based. With very few exceptions, earlier historians wrote in Turkish and did not enjoy the mobility of the 1980s generation. The language barrier kept the rich scholarship of many legendary historians away from the spotlight of world history. And I'm thinking of historians such as Ömer Lütfi Barkan, Cengiz Orhonlu, Osman Nuri Ergin. There are many others. A lot has changed in the past 5 decades, and Ottomans entered the discourse and the curricula worldwide through the work of a new wave of historians. I should add that they're not all Turkish, although Turks are in the majority. Professor Eldem's contribution to this exposure is most significant. Let me explain his role while focusing on what distinguishes him among his peers. First, his productivity and his incredible energy. A couple of months ago, in a Sakıp Sabancı Center seminar, our colleague Emanuel Sada complimented another historian, Isabel Grango, as a slow historian. I like that very much. I would now turn this powerful concept around and qualify Edhem Eldem as a fast historian in the most appreciative manner. Even a quick look at his list of publications makes one dizzy at his superhuman speed. He has, for example, sit tight, 285 scholarly articles. During the past 7 years, he gave 61 keynote lectures and 34 conference papers in international venues, hence revealing a mobility that the older generation could not even imagine. Neither can most of us today. I will not get carried away by the numbers, and please have no worries, I will not read the titles one by one. Edhem Eldem's intellectual curiosity is reflected in the wide variety of topics covered in his scholarly publications. I already went over them, but I think I'm going to do this one more time in a different way. 18th century trade, population makeup of the 19th century Istanbul, history of banking, career of one architect, Sedat Hakkı Eldem, various phases of Osman Hamdi Bey's life and career, including a 600 dictionary on him. Ottoman orders, medals and decorations, burial culture and death rituals, archaeology and museums, the Palace of the Alhambra, I could go on. Not expected from such a fast worker is his patience in concentrating on a few documents and scrutinizing them meticulously and creatively. Here I will get into some detail with a vignette that gives a glimpse into Edhem's agility in the archives. While we were working on the scramble, Edhem entertained the Zeynep, as he called Zeynep Bahrani and myself, around an infamous document, which claims to be the Italian translation of a firman about the permission given to Lord Elgin to move the Parthenon marbles. In the absence of the Ottoman original version, Edhem engaged in a delicate exercise to translate it back into the Turkish of the early 19th century, an exercise that only he could manage, or shall I say, only he would dare. In the process, he identified major problems. Although translated into English as any pieces of stone, the term qualche pezzi di pietra in Italian carried much ambiguity and could be read as some stones, certain stones, or a few stones. The Turkish of the time would say her bir taş, bazı taşlar, or just taşlar, hence every stone, some stones, or just stones. Obviously, the message would be different in each case. Ultimately, Eldem implies the linguistic analysis may not be very helpful to determine the provenance, but useful in showing the grayness of the claims. He also expanded his discussion of how Sultan Mahmud II handled the infamous affair, quoting another non-committal document, which stated that stones of this kind, decorated with figures, are not held in consideration among Muslims, but are appreciated by the Frankish states. The ambiguity is hence triangulated from the archive. Eldem crosses across disciplinary boundaries in his engagement with visual culture, as demonstrated by his commitment to exhibitions. To his credit, and unlike many historians, he does not use pictures as decorative accompaniments to his texts, but capitalizes on them to support his arguments. He has an onerous encounter with the discipline of art history, as his hardcore reliance on text as evidence may sometimes override the power of visual narratives at the discontent of art historians. However, his provocative outsider's perspective is always most welcome and taken very seriously. Publishing in a range of outlets, from scholarly periodicals to trade books, Eldem addresses a large readership. He contributes to public awareness of history by exhibitions, TV programs, and short articles in popular journals. He has in his CV an unusual category, which he playfully coins as vulgarization articles. These are excerpts from l'illustration on various episodes of Ottoman history, translated into Turkish and presented in the popular periodical Toplumsal Tarih. There are 172 of them so far. More are coming. In the same way, he serves public reading, French reading audiences. Most recently, in 2022, he published a survey of the Ottoman Empire in the widely read series Que sais-je. I would like to conclude by highlighting the scope of Professor Eldem's international recognition, albeit in truncated form. He taught at prestigious universities, among them UC Berkeley, Harvard, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and Columbia University. He also taught at, and most recently held, the International Chair of Turkish and Ottoman Studies at the Collège de France. This was from 2017 to 2022. He served and continues to serve on the editorial boards of leading journals, and he was a member of the Aga Khan Architectural Award Master Jury in 2019. Among his recent fellowships and awards are fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, 2011-12, Boğaziçi University Board of Trustees Award for Outstanding Research, 2015, fellowship at the Turkish Science Academy since 2018, and honorary fellowship at the Institute of Mediterranean Studies since 2021. Most recently and gloriously, he received the Medal of the Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur in 2022. Created in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte, the Légion d'Honneur is the highest civilian award given by the French Republic for outstanding service to France. We are looking forward to Professor Eldem's lecture, compellingly titled Turkish Empire, Ottoman Republic, Muslim Nation, History in 2023 Turkey. Welcome, Edhem.
Thank you very much. Neslihan, thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great honor, and it's such a pleasure to be back in Columbia after 6 years of separation, 2 of which involved that terrible pandemic we've been through. So it's really such an honor and a pleasure at the same time to be back, even if it's only for 4 or 5 days. It's an honor to contribute to the work of this center, the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. And I wish to thank, therefore, the organizers to have given me this opportunity to talk about my research in this prestigious context. Zeynep, my friend of how many years, I don't even know, gave a wonderful obituary of, and a very detailed one with some statistics I wasn't even aware of, but thank you so much. I mean, it was said with such generosity and kindness. But what I would underline is that we've worked a lot together. We still communicate and collaborate on many topics we have in common. And it's always a pleasure to be able to collaborate with a scholar of such depth and such width in terms of her interests. So this is going to be a very general vulgarization would be a way to put it. I love the word vulgarization, and I use it in its French version. Vulgarisation is a way of distinguishing something that is meant for the greater public, but is not popular. Popular is always problematic. Vulgarization is something where the historian or the scholar still keeps control over their material, and therefore conveys to a wider audience some of the findings, some of their opinions about the field in which they work. And in this particular case, it's obviously history in 2023. I have to say that I was never a fan of talking about the present. I always half jokingly say that I like them dead and preferably buried as a historian. But the circumstances of politics and of the situation in Turkey today have forced me in the past 5-6 years to give particular attention to the way in which history is being handled in Turkey. And I've tried as much as possible to do so with a claim at defending my turf, defending our turf, defending our discipline against what I consider to be a violation, a political, ideological violation of its autonomy and of the very logic behind it. So let me start with, let me start my presentation with an image I've chosen for the event poster. And let me, for the purposes of this exercise, treat this object as a document and interpret and contextualize it as best I can. This is a concrete construction of imposing dimensions. I've never seen it really, only in photographs. I don't think I want to see it from close, but it must be probably several meters high. This monument sits in the middle of a roundabout in the northwestern Anatolian town of Bilecik, where it was erected by the local municipality, then held by Erdogan's Party of Justice and Development, also known as the AKP. To anyone somewhat familiar with the Turkish political landscape, its basic symbolism is rather easy to decipher. The monument consists of a 3D transposition of the Ottoman coat of arms, and it is meaningfully located at the entrance of a town that claims to have witnessed the birth of the Ottoman state. The base bears the words, full of wisdom, of course, which Sheikh Edebali, the half-mythical mystic, allegedly spoke to his son-in-law, Osman Gazi, the eponymous founder of the Ottoman dynasty. İnsanı yaşat ki devlet yaşasın. Or, keep man alive so that the state can live. It's rather terrifying when you think of it. You may have guessed that my choice of this monument was not driven by its aesthetic merits, but rather by the palimpsest of history and ideology it reveals, topped with a good dose of anachronism. Indeed, contrary to the belief of most Turks, and probably of the designers of this object, the Ottoman coat of arms was invented only about a century and a half ago by the first ideologue and practitioner of political Islam, Sultan Abdülhamid II, to meet his desire to emulate the heavy symbolism of contemporary European monarchies. The result was a messy, busy, almost childish design, which transitioning into the third dimension certainly did not lighten or improve in any way. What is even more surprising is that the monument is riddled with anachronisms. The green flag on the original design, like its red counterpart, should have a crescent and a star. Instead, on the monument, it bears the three crescents so closely linked to the far-right Turkist movements of Republican times. As to the monogram, or tura, of the Sultan that should have crowned this Christmas tree, it was replaced by a basmala in the shape of a tura. In short, the monument stands like a synopsis of the way in which history has been turned into ideological fodder by the ruling party. A strong dose of Ottoman nostalgia, a solid base of Turkish nationalism, a heavy sprinkling of Islamic references, very little knowledge, and a lot of bad taste. The monument dates back to 2008, a time when the AKP's claims over the Ottoman past were still timid and its political leverage still limited. Much has changed since then, and the party's and its leaders' Ottomanist dreams have largely morphed into an ideology, however vague. Those who might remember the TV series Muhteşem Yüzyıl, or The Magnificent Century, that aired in 2008, may also remember that Erdogan's objection to the script had to do with his belief that Süleyman the Magnificent was depicted as spending most of his time in the harem rather than on the battlefront. This was a far cry from some of the arguments that are voiced today by those who claim to defend the honor of the Ottomans, led by the president himself. As to the series, one could hardly accuse it of ideological bias. The most important criticism one could bring against it is probably that it looked like an Orientalist spoof of the BBC's series, The Tudors. We should not forget that the AKP and Erdogan were not the first to have promoted a nostalgia for and a glorification of the Ottoman Empire. The repudiation of the Ottoman past by the Kemalist regime was largely based on a myth whose primary objective was to create an ancien régime that would legitimize the one that had just been established. Moreover, it would have been rather difficult to entirely dismiss the continuity represented by the officers and statesmen who formed the first cadres of the Republic. Nevertheless, there is no denying that the Kemalist government did sever its links with the past on many points. The abolition of the Sultanate was one such step, soon to be followed by the decision to do away with the Caliphate and the dynasty itself, and by the adoption of secularism and of the radical reforms meant to break all ties with a past increasingly stigmatized by Orientalist perceptions. By the 1930s, with the consolidation of the party state's power and the crystallization of Kemalist ideology, a rewriting of history led to more systematic cleansing of the Ottoman component of the grand narrative of the Turkish nation. However, contrary to general belief, it never disappeared entirely. Despite all efforts to incorporate the Hittites, the Sumerians, or even the Etruscans into this narrative, the Turkish vein still dominated, which made it all the less easy to bypass the Ottomans as the last offshoot of this lineage. A practical solution was found in the partial and selective appropriation of the past by praising the Ottomans of the early period as the glorious warriors of Turkish descent whose conquests extended from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, while their shameful successors fell under the influence of Islamic obscurantism and fanaticism and ended up kowtowing to an increasingly arrogant and invasive West. Simplistic as this script may sound, it had many advantages. It allowed for a demonization of Islam as the main cause of failure, while at the same time maintaining the ethnic, not to say racial, component of Turkish nationalism. Moreover, while recognizing the superiority of the secular and modern West, it nevertheless underlined its aggressive character, thus feeding into Kemalism's intrinsic xenophobia. As such, this setup perfectly fitted the ideological mold of the time. It linked the empire's initial success to the Turkish nature of its founders and blamed Islam for its final collapse. While this script certainly resembled the Orientalist version of Ottoman history, it confirmed the Kemalist policy aiming at the neutralization of Islam, perceived as the principal political threat to the regime. Obviously, the Kemalist version of history had serious shortcomings. starting with its reliance on political fiction that went against the population's dominant beliefs and culture. True, the myth of an uninterrupted Turkish identity over millennia, as symbolized by the stars representing the 16 Turkish states on the presidential banner, is still alive and well, especially on the right of the political spectrum. Yet, the claim that the Turkish nation could be linked to ancient Anatolian or even Amerindian civilizations has never really managed to flourish outside of the heavily monitored context of textbooks and school curricula. Today, only a few old diehard Kemalists still espouse these theories of another age. As to the writing or the rewriting of Ottoman history, it was very soon confronted with the harsh reality of a growing opposition to its objective of secularizing and demonizing the last centuries of the empire. In a sense, there was something logical and natural to the desire to connect with the last decades of the empire. After all, the Ottoman past was very recent. It had to do with the youth of many and with the lifetime of their parents, which made it difficult to consider it as an ancien regime on whose destruction the present legitimation depended. More importantly, perhaps, this period had already been impacted by profound changes that already prefigured the transformations of the Republic, starting with the rise of Turkish nationalism and identity, heavily blended with Islam. Yet apart from this natural thrust, the desire to clear the Ottoman past from all the crimes ascribed to it was also linked to a strong political movement rooted in Islam. Given that the opposition to the Kemalist regime was prominently based on political Islam, it was somewhat inevitable that it should feel the need to attack the Kemalist version of Ottoman history. It should not come as a surprise, then, that the first wave of rehabilitation took place in the 1950s under the Menderes government, which had come to power under the combined effect of an anti-Kemalist backlash and a promotion of traditional, i.e., Islamic values. The first timid steps in this direction were facilitated by the fortuitous overlap with the 5th centennial of the conquest of Constantinople in 1953. After all, Mehmed II had already been admitted into the pantheon of great Turks, recognized by Kemalism, which made the celebration of his deeds compatible with the official narrative. However, this imperial revival was coupled with a less innocent, more subversive historical campaign, that of the reconversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Given that its conversion into a museum, decreed in 1934 by Mustafa Kemal himself, stood among the strongest symbolic acts of Kemalist secularism, it was clear that this was an attack on the system in the name of Islam. Inevitably, given the polarization of Turkish politics around the issue of secularism, Ottoman history became increasingly enmeshed in political Islam, for which it became one of the main bases of legitimacy and claims against the Kemalist establishment's secularist ideology. Necip Fazıl Kısakürek became one of the predominant gurus of this line of thought, especially after the publication in 1965 of his work on Abdülhamid II, Ulu Hakan Abdülhamid Han, which translates as the Great Emperor Abdülhamid Han, in which he presented this autocrat as the last real sultan, who devoted his body and soul to the glory of Islam and to the survival of his state in the face of the joint onslaughts of Western powers and of their fifth column, the non-Muslim subjects of the empire. The argument was appealing. It replaced Islam at the center of, it replaced Islam at the center of Ottoman and Turkish identity, and whitewashed a character who had been unanimously condemned by Europe, by the Young Turks, and by the then predominant Kemalist version of history. Let us not forget that if nationalism relies essentially on the glorification of the state and of the great men, always, who made or led it, it also thrives on feelings of martyrdom and victimization easily associated with the life and career of Abdülhamid. While Necip Fazıl certainly had a serious following among Islamist circles, for decades, his Ottomanist claims remained limited to less polemical periods of the history of the empire. In an environment which still remained heavily guarded by the watchdogs of Kemalism, namely the army and the judiciary, it was less risky and more efficient to play the card of the great Turkish sultans and of the more glorious times of the empire. Even after the 1980 military coup, at a time when a progressive Islamization of politics had begun, this prudent stand was never really abandoned. Turgut Özal, whose Islamist and Ottoman sympathies were well known, relied mostly on the glorification of Ottoman culture at its alleged peak, rather than dipping in the murky waters of the end of the empire. He was greatly helped in this by the fact that nostalgia of the empire had taken hold of almost everyone, including liberals who saw it as a reflection of a bygone multiculturalism, and the affluent bourgeoisie who used it as symbols of a dignity it never had. The AKP and Erdogan thus inherited an eclectic ideological capital at the crossroads of conservative nationalism and of liberalism heavily tainted with Orientalism. It should not come as a surprise, then, that much like Özal before them, the AKP started by drawing on the empire's supposed golden age, from its mythical foundation to the grandeur of the 16th and 17th centuries. If Abdülhamid gained some vague visibility, it was mostly by accident through the imperial coat of arms he had invented, and which was picked up in the 1990s by many who believed it dated back to the first sultans. I particularly like the combination with Flipper. There was a decisive turn by the mid-2010s, when the first signs could be witnessed of an official policy aiming at claiming back Abdülhamid. To me, 2014 stands as the date at which his Tura started gracing the compact discs handed out to researchers at the Ottoman section of the State Archives. Soon enough came out the first attempts in the partisan press to draw a parallel between Abdülhamid and Erdogan, based on the common theme of the leader saving his country from the danger and encroachment of all forces united against it. In 2017, an imperial flop on public television crowned the process in the form of a television series bearing the still incomprehensible title of Payitaht Abdülhamid, which translates as the capital Abdülhamid. Still don't know what they meant by it, and whose main objective was to ensure a continuous back and forth between Abdülhamid's empire and Erdogan's Turkey. This phenomenon is not difficult to understand. We know that Erdogan has grown up and was formed in an environment where Necip Fazıl Kısakürek and his works were revered. Moreover, it is clear that Abdülhamid's appeal in those circles stems from the fact that he can be credited for the first systematic use of a modern and ideological Islam. but also that he was almost contemporary of Mustafa Kemal, the future Atatürk. This is probably the reason why the former's Tura seems to mirror the latter's signature, one of the most visible symbols of the cult built around his personality. Abdülhamid thus becomes a sort of anti-Kemal or anti-Atatürk, whose celebration amounts to a questioning and even a negation of everything associated with him, most particularly secularism. Ironically, this denotes a form of continuity in the use of symbolism. After all, if the rewriting of history and the cult of personality were an integral part of the Kemalist modus operandi, it should not come as a surprise that its opponents, in a way the wild children of Kemalism, should resort to very similar tactics. Returning to the monument I described in my introduction, can one really claim that it is essentially different from the Hittite solar disk that was erected 30 years earlier on Sıhhiye Square in Ankara? Obviously, one can always claim that compared to the institutional and scholarly efforts deployed by the Kemalist elite, the construction of Erdogan's Ottoman nostalgia looks rather sloppy and muddled. This may be true, even if the theme of our ancestors, the Hittite, does not strike me as very sophisticated. And one can express some wonder at hearing the AKP leader come up with untenable arguments, such as the claim that not an inch of land was ceded by Abdülhamid, when we know, well, that this was the period during which the empire recorded its most disastrous territorial losses. All Turkish versions of Ottoman history have always tried to have the cake and eat it, depict a powerful and victorious empire that was essentially benign and magnanimous, to the point of being exploited by ill-intentioned actors from within and from without. Yet one should not lose from sight that compared to his predecessors, Erdogan enjoys the enormous advantage of offering an overwhelming majority of the Turkish public exactly what it wants to hear, by freely drawing on Turkish nationalism and Islamic references in varying dosages adapted to the needs of the moment. In a country where secularism remains superficial and highly cosmetic, the advantage of being able to combine these two elements in total impunity with a populist and xenophobic discourse is much more powerful than all the arguments at the disposal of Kemalism to this day. Against the austere and far-fetched stories of Hittite or Etruscan heritage, Erdogan has for him the incomparable advantage of an eclectic and flexible narrative that appeals to the masses and which he can combine with visual means and props that can turn the Kemalist myth of the 16 Turkish states into a full-fledged, if disturbingly kitsch, pageantry. Nothing proves better the power of his populist discourse than the way in which the People's Republican Party, or CHP, which proudly claims the heritage of Kemalism, has felt the need to temper down its secularist discourse in order to adapt to the conservative atmosphere that dominates the country. Only 2 days ago, a photograph of the CHP leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, inadvertently standing on a prayer rug, has unleashed a wave of comments by AKP politicians intent on milking this golden opportunity to suggest that this was an intentional insult that proved where he and his party stood with regard to Islam, just short of spelling out the underlying accusation that he was an Alevi, thus forcing the transgressor into making public amends for a moment of inattention. One can safely predict that even if the AKP and Erdogan were to lose the upcoming elections of May 14th, the bar has irremediably been set at a level which will require that secularist discourse keep a low, if not apologetic, profile. Is this important? Not really, because Turkey has always been exposed and subjected to a historical discourse devoted to a political cause and to ideological priorities. Turkey suffers both from cliopathy and cliomania, my neologisms, as I call these diseases, meaning that it is at the same time sick and obsessed with history and has been so for over a century. This observation may reassure us to a certain point, as it somehow normalizes and banalizes the situation. Yielding to a form of fatalism, we may well think that if this has been the case for over 100 years, there is little reason that we may hope for it to change in the near future. We may have to accept, for example, that the brief springtime of historiography witnessed at the very beginning of this millennium, when it seemed that the taboos of official history were about to collapse, was merely an aberration, a moment of destruction, and that if some did fall, they were soon to be replaced by new ones. One can also find solace in the idea that all this populist discourse rings hollow, and that despite its immediate appeal, its consequences may be rather volatile. Finally, painful as it may be for historians to see their discipline constantly attacked and even violated by political and ideological uses and abuses, we do have the consolation of knowing that in some scholarly circles, it has made undeniable and hopefully irreversible progress. And yet, there are many and serious reasons for pessimism. Indeed, if the discipline is faring relatively well, this is true only of a handful of universities, while the production of the remaining 200 or so seems to be dangerously in tune with political demagogy and populist ideology. Moreover, how can one not worry about the future of the discipline, in fact, of all disciplines, when we know that a systematic onslaught has been launched by the government with a view to tame the few universities that have managed to maintain some degree of autonomy and academic freedom? I believe an even greater danger lies in the fact that the historical discourse I've described may not be as hollow as one might think. That it should be superficial and riddled with inconsistencies does not necessarily make it less powerful. In a country where nationalism remains the defining ideology and where secularism is based on a general consensus that only Muslims can be real Turks, the AKP version of history is bound to have a deep impact. Given that practically all political parties claim to be nationalist, the AKP has two major options at its disposal to stand out on the political scene. The first is to outbid the others, on the one hand by allying with the MHP, the Nationalist Movement Party, openly situated at the far right of the spectrum, and on the other, by using its control of the state apparatus to promote an aggressive and polemical foreign policy and entertain the idea of an impending threat to the country. The second consists in resorting to Islamic discourse and values as a factor of differentiation, to the point of taking up the role of the champion of the only true religion against Kemalism and its successors. The reconversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque less than 3 years ago gives a clear sense of the power that these strategies can unleash. The monument's conversion into a museum in 1934 was realized like a fait accompli and had then to be defended practically manu militari as one of the symbols of modernity and secularism. In 2020, its re-sacralization was celebrated like a high mass of nationalism and Islam combined, while the opposition could barely utter any other objection than the disregard for health measures at the peak of the pandemic. It is to be feared that the upcoming elections will fuel even more the existing polarization, and that the possibility of a defeat will unleash even more populism and Islamic nationalist rhetoric on part of the AKP and its leader. While these observations may sound troubling enough, I would like to now direct my attention to an even more problematic aspect of the role and the state of history in Turkey today. Up to this point, I have addressed issues relating to discourse, representations, and rhetoric, whose connection to historical reality remains at best tenuous and random. But what about some aspects of this reality whose impact on the present may have exceeded the simple context of a rhetorical discourse and truly established a form of continuity between past and present beyond nostalgic dreams and revivalist arguments? Without falling into the trap of determinism, and there are some notions or practices that Republican Turkey may have inherited from its imperial predecessor. After all, if we agree that the Kemalist argument of a break with the recent past was largely a political fiction, would we not have to come to the conclusion, a bit like Erdogan, that Turkey is indeed heir to the Ottoman Empire and that it has every right to claim its inheritance? I will not go into easily identifiable and rather obvious aspects of cultural continuity, although it would have been interesting to examine the logic and consequences of the continuing use of, say, the Islamic notion of shaheed, martyr, to qualify those who have fallen at the front or who have died during the exercise of their official duties. Instead, I will focus on two phenomena which I believe illustrate perfectly some of the most problematic aspects of continuity between empire and republic. The first concerns the notion of justice/equity, adalet, whose importance in Ottoman political thought and discourse is well known, and which has shown so much resilience that it remains at the center of present-day Turkish politics. My argument is that against this omnipresence of justice, the notion of equality, eşitlik, is practically absent from the political discourse. Indeed, fair, adil, and justice, adalet, seem to be the most recurrent terms in the nomenclature of Turkish political parties, including the AKP. While equality, eşitlik, as I said, of a much less frequent use, remains the appanage of Kurdish parties and of the genuine left of the political spectrum. May I remind you that while the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 drew its rhetorical inspiration from the French Revolution, including its motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité, translated as hürriyet, musavat, uhuvvet, it also made sure to add a fourth term, of course, adalet, justice. There is a reason for the ubiquitousness of justice and the parsimonious use made of equality. If Ottomans were so fond of justice or of equity, it was because justice constituted an alternative to equality in a society that was inegalitarian and hierarchical. Men over women, Muslims over all others, the free over the enslaved, the rulers over the ruled. Justice or equity was the ideal tool to manage such inequalities by ensuring that they did not lead to abuses, while at the same time respecting the existing hierarchy. As long as both parties agreed to the rules of the game, social peace could be maintained. The basic principle was to, quote unquote, know one's boundaries, haddini bilmek, meaning that no one should ever overstep the limits of their status. It was not before the mid-19th century that the Ottomans were confronted with the notion of equality, when the great powers, especially Britain and France, forced them to promulgate an edict granting equal rights to all subjects regardless of creed. The state played along and began the unprecedented practice of recruiting non-Muslims into the administration. The overwhelming majority of the Muslim population, however, learned how to circumvent this offense to its traditionally recognized superiority by following the example of the proverbial imam, who, when asked by his parishioners the meaning of this reform, simply answered, "Bundan böyle gavura gavur denmeyecek." We shall no longer call the damned infidels damned infidels. This fiction is still alive and well in Turkey, where despite secularism, a general consensus exists that only Muslims are really Turks. Even though there is no law against it, state and public administration is inaccessible to non-Muslims. Just a few months ago, the appointment of a citizen of Armenian descent, as the press loves to call them, never using any reference to descent when talking of Muslims, to a position of district governor, kaymakam, caused much emotion and consternation throughout the country. Under these circumstances, the fact that universities constitute the only branch of the state sector where non-Muslim enrollment or recruitment has been possible may well be taken as an indicator of the lower value attached to it compared to more vital areas of the administration. Yet, if there is one notion that illustrates well the fictional character of equality in Turkey, it is probably that of tolerance, hoşgörü, which is almost unanimously viewed and praised as a virtue that should define one's attitude towards non-Muslims, or for that matter, towards any ethnic, political, cultural, or sexual minority, without even realizing that this term reveals a form of condescension mixed with disgust, so typical of the arrogance that comes with a sense of superiority. Personally, and without any claim to anthropological skills, I think I can show how widespread this practice is among Turkish society still today, simply by referring to the unilateral use of sen. You don't have it in English, but tu, vous, sen, siz, tu. Indeed, there are many social interactions where one person can freely call the other tu, without any reciprocity, without being called back to, and where the person thus treated does not take offense and even considers this to reflect an internalized form of hierarchy. Landlords do it to their doormen, bosses to their workers and employees, politicians to their electors, state officials to citizens of modest rank, city dwellers to peasants, restaurant patrons to their waiter, the elderly to the young, the educated to the others, the white Turks to the darker ones, or much closer to home, university professors to their students. Is this important? One could dismiss this practice as being quote unquote cultural, which it obviously is. But I believe the existence of such a pattern involves the acceptance, not to say the promotion, of inequality and the legitimation of inegalitarian power relations. It proves to what extent a conventional sense of hierarchy is embedded in the country's social and political fabric, to the point of internalization by the majority of the population, thus standing in the way of one of the most basic democratic reflexes one can think of. Of course, one should not take this condemnation to an ahistorical level. I would be the first to recognize the merits of equity in the Ottoman past. After all, this is how the empire managed and maintained an ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity in ways that were simply unthinkable in contemporary Europe. If the West can claim to have invented equality, This was possible only after centuries of expulsion, exclusion, and assimilation that ended up forcefully homogenizing entire populations, generally around a religious identity. Moreover, one cannot fail to see that the notion of equality as applied in the West throughout the 19th century and part of the 20th century was extremely selective, especially in terms of its application or lack thereof in the peripheries. Is it not ironic that in 1856, the Ottoman state was forced to grant equality to all its subjects across the empire by two colonial empires, Great Britain and France, for whom equality had no meaning or application outside of a white, male, and almost exclusively Christian homeland, the métropole of the French. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. What really counts is to note that present-day Turkey has inherited and internalized a political notion that allows it to circumvent, or at best, that prevents it from adopting fully the principle of equality. It is this fear and shunting of equality by a majority who sees any challenge to its traditional superiority as contrary to the natural order of things and to the essence of the state that constitutes one of the most serious obstacles to the development of democracy in Turkey. In the past century and a half, justice, equity, as an alternative to equality, has been a powerful instrument that maintains the illusion of an equivalence between the two and threatens any group or individual questioning or defying this fiction. A second and last element of continuity I consider to be perhaps even more threatening to Turkish politics has to do with the possible sources of authoritarianism in the past 150 years. Some years ago, I had already suggested that Abdülhamid may well have been the founding father of the Turkish state as we know it today. A fact that would give a different twist to the way in which this sultan's heritage is claimed by political Islam in Turkey, most recently by Erdogan and his followers. Well, there's no doubt that his Islamist policies constitute a meaningful turning point in Ottoman and Turkish history. I believe that his major and most durable contribution is the dismantlement of the state institutions and the rule of law, laboriously and quite superficially built by the statesmen of the Tanzimat, and their replacement by an authoritarian, in fact, autocratic system based on personal and absolutist power, on informal networks, rooted in relations of obedience and loyalty, and consequently on the downgrading of institutions to a symbolic level when they were not done away with entirely. Anecdotal as it may be, I love quoting one short passage from a letter by Edhem Pasha, then ambassador in Berlin, to Safet Pasha, Minister of Foreign Affairs, in August 1876, at a time when the reformist Mithat Pasha was trying to draft a constitution which, he hoped, would save the empire from the violent crisis in which it had fallen. An unconditionally conservative defender of the Tanzimat's top-down and rather authoritarian reform program, Edhem Pasha voiced his skepticism regarding this radical reform with a rather striking formula. Bize konstitusyon değil, institusyon lazım. Or, it is not a constitution, but institutions we need. Apart from the fact that he was incapable of finding Turkish words to describe these two notions, and that he would end up serving as Grand Vizier under Abdülhamid, his words had a prophetic ring if one considers that Abdülhamid's 3 decades of reign would do precisely the opposite of what Edhem Pasha wished for and dismantle practically every institution of the state. While I'm aware of the risk of falling into the trap of a Turkish Sonderweg, I still think that Abdülhamid set a significant precedent for a number of regimes that ruled Turkey during the last decades of the empire and the republic from the 1920s on. From Abdülhamid to the triumvirate of Enver, Talat, and Cemal, from the unionist dictatorship to the Kemalist party state, from the eternal leader to the national leader, from İsmet İnönü to Menderes, and from Özal's populism to Erdogan's authoritarian system, it seems that there is a pattern that leaves little hope for the establishment of a solid democratic system and tradition. At the root of the problem is, I believe, the fact that contrary to general belief, the Turkish state is intrinsically weak and consists of a quasi-empty shell, which, in the absence of a solid institutional framework, is up for grabs, and that the ultimate goal of political actors is to conquer it, to own and control it. Sometime last year, Erdogan addressed Kılıçdaroğlu with a fascinating comment, which was meant to dismiss him as a political rival. "Who would surrender the state to you?" he said, using the verb teslim etmek, surrendering, which unequivocally referred to an act of appropriation that probably described in his mind his own relation to the state. I will conclude by saying that I'm conscious that I have painted a rather gloomy picture of history, its uses, and its heritage in Turkey today. I have two excuses for this. First, I believe that a proper assessment requires a critical stand and approach, and that a half-empty glass is always more conducive to it than a half-full one. Second, there's an obvious advantage to pessimism. It reduces substantially your chances of being disappointed. Of course, I have no solution to offer to the problems I have listed. I often half-jokingly suggest that history should be banned from the curricula of Turkish schools, and even better, from political discourse altogether. A more constructive approach would consist in saying that the antidote to all these evils is history. Solid, critical history based on research, and most of all, open-ended curiosity, one of the scarcest commodities in my country. Given the dynamics I've tried to describe, this may well happen only when, as I say, pigs fly. But I also believe that history expects that every historian will do their duty to reach this goal, however unattainable it may seem today. Thank you.
Thank you, Edhem, for this wonderful, challenging, thought-provoking lecture. And we don't have too much time, but we'll take questions. So please raise your hands, and could I please ask you to clarify your name and your affiliation when you ask the question. Otherwise, we have a hard time of identifying them.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. My name is Emre Erol. I'm from Sabancı University, Foundations Development Director and Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences faculty member. When I was listening to your talk, I felt like most of your reading of what's happening now with AKP, let me call this use and abuse of history, has a pattern in it. And most of this pattern you explained by looking at the past. And you talked about the Kemalist past, for instance. What is your opinion about the present? Because when you look at the present, it doesn't look like, at least to me, that this is only happening in Turkey. Like look at Putin, Modi, Trump here. This make Turkey great again kind of an attitude, this populist use of history is kind of all over the place. And at one point, even you showed this kind of neo-Baroque, Rococo kind of imperial hotel or whatever. I think it's like Trump Tower to me, like this, even the aesthetics of it and the fun in the aesthetics of it is all around, but you've never talked about it in your talk. I'm curious about your opinion about the present explanations of that.
Well, thank you. Is this, do I mute, select? Thank you. Do something. Okay. Yes, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I made a conscious choice of not relativizing the Turkish case, but what you say is true. With, of course, differences. I think that the question of continuity between the Romanov Empire, the Soviet Empire, and Putin's empire is much more convincing than whatever Erdogan can say about Turkey today and its connection to the past. So, yes. Then again, you said it, Trump is a good example of, in a sense, political kitsch, making it to the top. But what is also interesting is that he's been inducted. And I think that indicates that something has worked, with difficulty, you might say, in the United States that doesn't seem to be working in Turkey: institutions, the judiciary. So, of course, but this would probably go in the direction of what I said about the half full and half empty glass. If I start talking about, oh yes, this is happening everywhere, sure, it's true. But to me, what is crucial is to understand it from the perspective of my own discipline, my area of specialty, and the case I know best. So I've made this choice, and I think it would have been very difficult to give a broad assessment of what's happening in the present throughout the world in terms of the recuperation of the past. I mean, I could talk about the French example, which is interesting. I mean, in France, the extreme right, Le Pen and Zemmour, are the ones who've made a systematic use of history. I mean, the history is the trademark of the right, obviously, of the nationalism of the right and whatever. But then again, I think I would have had great difficulty organizing a talk around such a broad perspective of what's going on in the world. Plus, I'm not going to say that I don't like the present. I'm very happy with, but then again, I try to limit it as much as possible to an analysis of, and I find it much more interesting to talk about continuities. I mean, what I said about adalet, justice, what I said about authoritarianism is something I am much more comfortable with because I can document it in a very traditional historiographical way, instead of treating the present as a social scientist would today. So I'm pretty sure a political scientist would have a very different take on what's happening today in Turkey, and would probably find other factors to be much more significant. But I stick to history. I already feel uncomfortable moving through centuries. So at least what I can do is limit myself to my history and to my area of specialty. But otherwise, yes, I agree with what you say.
And it's something, sure. But even when you look at the Kemalist period in 1930s, even when you look at the Kemalist period in 1930s from a historian's point of view, there's still a lot of, let's say, macro or global input to why the Kemalists in 1930s were trying to go back to Hittites, because everybody else was trying to prove that they were a member of the white race, So even historically, there's a continuity that Turkey is not isolated from what's happening, politically speaking, on a macro level. Maybe that should factor in as well.
You're right. You're right. I mean, it's obvious that the Turkish thesis of history in the 1930s, it's not necessarily, it's about claiming whatever civilizations the West has left behind. You can't do the Greco-Roman stuff. You can't do the Judeo-Christian. oh my God, nobody's claimed the Etruscans. Nobody knows exactly where they come from, the Sumerians and whatever. That's good. And it has a territorial thing. It is about claiming your link as a nation to a territory from which you basically are afraid they're going to kick you out. The legitimacy of your presence is something that has been challenged ever since the 19th century, especially with Gladstone and whatever, you know. So yes, I mean, there are so many factors. I agree. Yes.
We have very
yeah,
little
right.
time, so maybe we should.
No, but the
see if
questions
there
were
are
so
questions.
good.
Yes. Thank you.
Abdullah Ustansel, City University of New York. Thank you very much for this wonderful, highly stimulating and provocative talk. Allow me to make a comparison. Bal kaymak yer gibi. I really enjoyed it. However, you also confused me a lot. And I don't want to be a historian. And I'm glad I'm not. I have many questions for you, and I don't want to ask them all. The first one, actually a little point, you mentioned that young Turks added adalet, justice, to the motto. Given my rural background, I'm a little bit suspicious that throughout the centuries, the Ottoman society was highly corrupt. And there was a deliberate need for adalet. Was that the cause? The second question, as early as 1950, Turkey went in the path of a democratic state. What could Menderes or Demirel done differently so Turkey would have not come to this point today? I'm asking you this as a kind of a thought experiment. I hope you can enlighten me. Thanks.
Thank you. About adalet, justice. Obviously, it is ever since the 16th century when Kınalızade came up with this daire-i adalet, the circle of equity or the circle of justice. It is one of the fundamental principles of Ottoman political rhetoric and ideology. I don't think we can reduce it only to the notion of justice as you would have it in the tribunals. It is justice, divine justice. And the beauty of it, as I try to explain, is that you can have justice in an unequal society. And the whole point, and therefore justice becomes a mechanism by which you justify and limit the inequalities in society by, for example, treating your enslaved persons in a humane way. So slavery is not going away, but you know that you should not treat them in one way or another. So yeah. Now, counterfactual history, I think Menderes is a good example of a post-Kemalist. He was also a Kemalist. He came from the same environment. And he's, I think, one of the best examples of a democratic backlash against years of a party state that eventually moves in the direction of the reproduction of the state party, of the party state model, which I call the conquest of the state. So the Turkish system, by and large, has been most democratic when there was no majority, when there was political instability in the 1970s, for example, and when no political party could claim to control the mechanisms of the state to the point of instituting this conquest of the state. So Menderes tried. But Menderes was opposed by the watchdogs of Kemalism, the judiciary and the army. So
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. I love the talk, and it's very nice to hear about Turkey because I don't live there anymore. But so this problem of the abuse of history, it is actually happening at many different fields of history too. It is happening now in my field, and to a great degree, and I'm a medievalist, as you know, that, for example, among the people who stormed the Capitol, there were those wearing Viking heads, and there were a lot of protests in many other parts of America. That people were dressed as medieval knights, and my colleagues have been up in arms against that. So they've been publishing book after book showing view of the Middle Ages as interracial, you know, and very different than what is, it's not only about Vikings and knights. Anyway, I'm not going to go on forever, but what I wanted to ask you is that what can exactly academic historians do in Turkey to combat that? I mean, here, what I see from my own medieval colleagues is that they are doing constantly conferences, putting together websites. I don't know if it's doing any effect, but what do you think, how one should combat with it?
Okay, your plight is obvious, and this is something that has been going on since the 19th century. And we know, for example, that Le Pen, we talked about him, was a big fan of Jeanne d'Arc. It's interesting how certain characters can be used for extremely different, sometimes completely diametrically opposed political stands. Jeanne d'Arc as feminism, Jeanne d'Arc as a symbol of non-binariness, and Jeanne d'Arc as a symbol of French fascism, basically, or nationalism. It's terrifying. But it's also true that there's a strong community of historians who have the means of setting the record straight. It's never going to change what is happening in the street or in, it's inevitable. I mean, that is something, it would be, I think, very naive to think that you can censor, in a sense, political discourse or abuses. I'm not into that. What I propose, what I feel is missing in Turkey is a scholarly debate, and one notch below, a good vulgarization debate, right? I think that's absolutely crucial. I mean, again, the French example is what I know best. Historia, l'Histoire are magazines that sell in tens of thousands. In Turkey, there's probably only 2 historical magazines who sell each 2,000, 3,000 in a country of 85 million. So it's nothing. So basically, you're preaching to the choir, you're preaching to people who are already convinced. But then again, I think that's all we can do. I mean, what I did here is vulgarization. It is a mix of some of my research and a lot of intuitive and sometimes far-fetched connections. And I think that's the best we can do because we don't have the necessary institutions and platforms for this to happen. I said there's only a handful, I don't know what that means, 5, 10, of universities in Turkey that deserve to be called universities. The rest is doing under the name of scholarship something that is practically identical with what politicians are doing. So that is really terrifying. So I don't have any solution, but I think, you know, basically, plodding through good old history and producing and never forgetting that you need that intermediate level of vulgarization. I think that's one way to limit the
On this grim note, let's ask for one more question. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark van der Meer. I teach history here, ancient history. So actually you showed a book by the Sumerologist on Ataturk and the Hittites. And actually it seems to me that access to or control over the textbook market is crucial in this. And I think Çelik did work on textbooks in the Kemalist period. So is there a control of the textbook market at this point? Are academics involved in writing history textbooks in Turkey. Can you elucidate that a little bit?
The Turkish market for textbooks, not academic, but school textbooks, is something that is completely disconnected from scholarship, from the universities, and that's a pity, and of course, the major difference to which I alluded is that the Kemalist regime had very limited means in terms of, the divulgation, the diffusion of its message. I mean, textbooks. And, kids in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they would read this and never believe it, the Hittites. It's not like Nos ancêtres les Gaulois, which had a meaning because, there was some kind of a concrete evidence, and it was backed by Astérix et Obélix, because popular culture is always extremely important. In the case of Kemalism, they had nothing else than naming banks after the Hittites, the Sumerians, and whatever. And, it's not a very strong argument. I mean, you're not going to be a convinced Anatolianist because you've deposited your bank at your money at Etibank or Sumer Bank. So it's very limited. Whereas now what we have is something very different. You don't need to control the curricula and textbooks because you already have the media. You have trolls, you have the political parties. Everybody and his uncle is already contributing to the mythology of this continuity between the glorious, So it's terrifying in that sense. So I don't know exactly how the market works, but if it works more or less as it did 20 years ago, whatever, you basically have contractors who make money out of producing textbooks that pretty much reproduce the official discourse. It would be interesting, and people are probably doing it, but it's another field. It would be interesting to look at the contents of curricula in a very detailed way across time. See how it evolves, what disappears, what remains. Are they still talking about the Hittites? Now, are the Hittites linked if they talk about them? Are they? I really don't know. Because again, I think the major problem is that there's a complete disconnect between that educational context and the universities. So it would be nice if universities would contribute more, because that is, again, good vulgarization. And if they can't do it, then my proposition is basically that we stop teaching these kids history. It doesn't, I'm exaggerating, but I mean, what I noticed in Turkey is that people, ask anybody in the street, they'll say, oh, history is so important. History is your past, your future, your present, your whatever, I mean, and then you try to figure out what they read. They basically read what they already know or think they know. So it's, no, it's not even Twitter. I mean, if they buy a book, it's going to be a book that the title of which is already a suggestion that it's going to give them exactly what they want to hear. So that's what I mean about the absence of curiosity. I still believe that, in history, the major input for good history is curiosity, open-ended curiosity. And even that is missing in scholarly circles. I mean, there's a lot of historical work that is done not out of curiosity, but in order to prove something you already have in your mind. And that's very problematic. I mean, we know this is true. Thank you.
Grim note, but thank you. Thank you very much again, Edhem. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's
And a great thank you. Please join us at the reception outside.
and a great thank you to Nesihan, to you, and to Ararat Shekerian, who basically did this. I was going to say single-handedly, but that would be an exaggeration, but still, thank you very much.